Okay, let's jump into something big today. It feels like the whole global economic picture is, well, kind of shifting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Fragmentation, trade tensions.
Absolutely. And there's been noticeable protectionism, particularly some policies coming out of the U.S. in recent years, thinking back to the Trump presidency and related actions.
Right. And that pressure, it seems, has really pushed Asian nations to think differently.
Exactly.
Right.
Policymakers, scholars, they're dusting off this really ambitious idea. A single Asian market, maybe even a single Asian currency. It's about exploring deeper regional ties as a strategic buffer against all this external uncertainty.
So this deep dive, we're basing it on a systematic literature review, right? Covering the last 5 years, 2020 to 2025.
That's the one, by Kevin Ho and Dr. Narong Petparzer from Rangsit University. They looked specifically at the prospects for economic and monetary union involving China, Japan, India, and ASEAN, big players.
Our mission then is to unpack what they found for you. We'll look at why this idea is resurfacing now, the huge challenges, maybe lessons from Europe.
And the potential upsides, too. What could a way forward look like? Is this unified Asian bloc actually realistic or even beneficial given the challenges of the mid-21st century?
We'll guide you through the key takeaways from the research, help you understand the drivers, the roadblocks, and really why this whole conversation matters right now.
Okay, so let's start there. The global context. Why is this idea gaining traction now?
All right. Well, the review really points to a pretty major shift in U.S. trade policy starting around 2017, a definite move away from multilateralism towards more protectionist stuff.
Yeah, and the research gives specific examples. Those Section 301 tariffs on China, for instance, basically kicked off a trade war, didn't they?
And the U.S. pulling out of the TPP in 2017. That sent a strong signal.
Plus the steel and aluminum tariffs, Section 232. And more recently, things like the Inflation Reduction Act with its Buy American elements and the Chichappies Act restricting semiconductor tech.
And the recalls this, deglobalization,
Yep.
decoupling, basically prioritizing domestic industries and supply chains.
Yeah. And the impact on Asia was real. Export growth slowed down, especially China to the U.S. Supply chains started shifting, companies trying to get around the tariffs. Vietnam, for example, sometimes benefited from that.
But beyond the economics, it created this atmosphere of uncertainty, maybe even distrust in global trade.
Definitely. So Asia's traditional growth model, that export-led one relying heavily on Western markets, it's facing a serious challenge. It feels like a real turning point for the region.
A pivotal moment.
It is. And Asia's response seems to be doubling down on regional solutions, more focus on boosting trade within Asia, building regional supply chains, signing their own trade deals.
So this is where initiatives like RCEP come in.
Exactly. RCEP is a prime example highlighted in the review. Finalized 2020, took effect 2022. It's huge ASEAN plus 5 others, about 30% of global GDP. And crucially, it created the first FTA link between China, Japan, and South Korea.
That link seems important. Hedging their bets, maybe?
That's how many see it. RCEP, as Asia, hedging against global instability by deepening its internal market. And look at the CPTPP after the U.S. left, Japan led the effort to revive it. Shows key Asian players are willing to push forward with integration on their own terms. It's this kind of open regionalism.
Open but focused inward more.
Focused on building regional frameworks, yeah. And it's not just trade. The financial side is crucial, too. The review talks about the weaponization of the U.S. dollar.
Meaning using it for sanctions, like against Iran or Russia.
Precisely. That's made Asian countries think hard about relying so much on the dollar system. Add to that the U.S. Fed rate hikes in 2022-23, which destabilized Asian economies dependent on dollar funding.
So calls for alternatives are getting louder.
Yes. Like Malaysia's PM Anwar Ibrahim in 2023 suggesting reviving the idea of an Asian Monetary Fund, an AMF, specifically to reduce reliance on the dollar and the IMF. It's still just talk, really no concrete shape yet, but it shows the direction of thinking.
Okay, so bringing it all together, this backdrop of global fragmentation, trade tensions, financial uncertainty.
It's compelling Asia to cooperate more regionally. As the Asian Development Bank put it, it's about building a buffer against global shocks. And that context gives this whole idea of a single Asian market and currency fresh momentum, takes it from, academic theory towards something potentially more pressing.
Right, makes sense. So given that context, how far has Asia actually come on integration? What's the starting point for this grand vision?
Well, Asia's journey is really different from Europe's. Historically, it's been much more market-driven, less about formal institutions, think trade flows, investment, those complex supply chains weaving across
Flips
borders.
Factory Asia model, right? Lots of parts crossing borders.
Exactly. East Asia saw huge growth in that kind of intra-regional trade, especially in intermediate goods. But the review uses this interesting term, mal-integrated.
Malintegrated, meaning
Highly connected for production, yes, but the final products were mostly heading outside the region to Western markets. There wasn't the same focus on creating a unified Asian consumer market or harmonizing rules for that purpose, not until more recently anyway.
so components flowed easily, but maybe not finished goods or services for Asian consumers within Asia.
Largely, yes. Now, there are formal institutions, of course. ASEAN, founded way back in '67, initially focused more on political stability.
But later moved towards economics. AFTA, the free trade area.
Right, after they reduced tariffs. And then the big vision for the Asian Economic Community, the AEC, aiming for free flow of goods, services, investment, skilled labor by 2015.
And did they get there? A true single market by 2015.
Well, the AEC officially launched, but the reality fell quite short. Intra-Asian trade is still stuck around 22–25% of their total trade. Compare that to the EU, where it's over 60%.
Big difference. Why the gap?
Persistent non-tariff barriers, different regulations across countries. It's slow going. The review calls it incremental and uneven, reflecting these very sovereignty-minded approaches. States are just hesitant to give up national control.
That cautiousness seems key. Did the 1997 Asian financial crisis change anything? That was a huge shock.
It was a catalyst, definitely. It led to the ASEAN plus 3 framework. That's ASEAN plus China, Japan, South Korea. And the Chiang Mai Initiative, CMI.
The currency swap lines.
Exactly. Started as bilateral swaps in 2000, then became the multilateral CMI in 2010, a $240 billion regional reserve pool, a safety net.
$240 billion sounds substantial.
It is, but relative to the economies, it's small compared to Europe's rescue fund, the ESM. CMI is about 1.5% of ASEAN plus 3 GDP. The ESM is around 8% of EU GDP.
And there's a catch to using it.
A big one. Drawing a large chunk of CMI funds, it used to be 90%, now 60 or 70%, still requires having an IMF program in place.
Ah, so still reliant on global institutions, the IMF stigma problem.
Precisely. It hinders the CMI from being a truly independent regional firewall. And then there's Asia's trade setup, often called that noodle bowl.
The mess of overlapping trade deals.
Yeah. RCP, CPTPP, ASEAN plus 1 deals, bilateral agreements. It's complex. RCEP and CPTPP are maybe consolidating it a bit, but it's still multiple layers, not one single market.
So summing up this part. Asia is integrating, but it's patchy, market-led mostly, lots of different agreements, cautious governments, not a deep, unified institutional structure.
That's a good way to put it. The ADB found Asia-Pacific matches the EU on things like supply chains, maybe people movement, but is miles behind on supranational governance. That's the reality any bolder vision has to contend with.
Okay, speaking of bolder visions, let's get into the specifics. A single Asian market and currency, what would that actually look like?
It's a huge leap, really taking cues from the EU. A single market means genuinely free movement, goods, services, capital, maybe even labor. Removing all barriers, harmonizing rules, recognizing standards across the board.
And the single currency part.
That implies a common monetary authority, like a central bank for Asia, potentially replacing national currencies or at least locking them together extremely tightly.
Where'd this radical idea come from?
It really gained steam after the 97–98 Asian crisis. That painful experience currencies collapsing, needing IMF bailouts, pushed people to think about regional solutions. Japan proposed an Asian monetary fund back then, and academics started exploring ideas like an Asian currency unit, an ACU, maybe a basket currency.
But the early thinking wasn't too keen on a full currency union, was it?
No, not really. Research in the 2000s and early 2010s generally found Asia, especially ASEAN, didn't meet the classic conditions for an optimum currency area OCA criteria.
Why not?
Too much economic diversity, meaning shocks hit countries differently, asymmetric shocks. Plus, varying inflation, low labor mobility because of language and cultural barriers, and crucially, no strong regional institutions to manage it all. The verdict then was not feasible short to medium term. Focus on smaller steps.
Has that view shifted at all with newer research?
There's maybe a slightly more nuanced picture for the very long run. The review mentions a 2024 study by Hafner looking at Southeast Asia. It still says the region is far from being an optimum currency area,
Right.
but it notes some trends have improved things slightly. less economic specialization, more openness. These could potentially reduce those asymmetric shocks over time.
Interesting. So a glimmer of possibility.
A glimmer. Hafner's model suggests potential long-run gains from a currency union in ASEAN, higher income, more investment, lower unemployment if, and it's a big if, they tackle the structural problems and achieve significant economic convergence first. The idea is the efficiency gains might eventually outweigh losing monetary independence if they get their economies much more aligned. So the research, it may yet still keep the door opened in the long run.
Okay, so it's incredibly tough, but maybe not totally impossible way down the line.
Yeah.
What are the specific benefits the literature talks about if they could pull it off?
The potential upsides are pretty compelling. Getting rid of currency exchange costs and volatility is huge. That research cited estimated an 11–14% trade boost just within ASEAN from a common currency. Imagine that scaled up.
And financially,
It could really accelerate financial integration, help keep Asia's huge savings pool invested within Asia instead of mostly flowing out to the West.
and globally, more clout.
Potentially, yes. A single Asian currency could become a serious global player, maybe challenging the dollar's dominance eventually. That means less vulnerability to U.S. policy, less dependence on the dollar fitting with that whole de-dollarization trend.
Okay, the benefits sound good, but the costs and challenges must be astronomical.
They are really substantial. Top of the list, giving up independent monetary policy, your own interest rates, your exchange rate. These are core tools for managing your economy, especially for developing countries. Ceding that control is massive.
And the lack of fiscal backup. Learning from the Eurozone crisis.
That's a huge lesson. Europe found out the hard way. You need mechanisms for fiscal support when some countries hit recessions and others don't, especially if they can't devalue their currency. Asia lacks anything like the EU's bailout funds or transfer mechanisms.
And that massive political hurdle, sovereignty.
Probably the biggest obstacle of all. Many Asian states guard their autonomy fiercely, often rooted in recent history. Pooling sovereignty in a regional central bank, giving up national symbols on currency notes. It's deeply sensitive politically and culturally. Add in the different political systems, the mistrust between major powers. It's incredibly difficult to build the necessary political will and trust. We'll definitely dig more into these challenges.
Okay, this is clearly super complex. To get a better handle on why it's so hard and the different ways it might play out, let's look through the lens of international political economy theories, IPE frameworks.
Right. These theories give us different angles on what drives integration or holds it back. The review looks at several, and they each offer useful insights for Asia.
Let's start with liberal intergovernmentalism. What's that view?
This one sees integration as states making deals based on hard-nosed national economic interests. States call the shots, they keep control, and regional institutions are just tools they create and limit.
So for Asia, it predicts
Slow, careful progress. Integration only happens when national interests clearly align and states negotiate painstakingly to protect their sovereignty. You see evidence in the diverging interests. China, Japan, India often have different goals. Think India pulling out of RCEP or the ongoing China-Japan mistrust. ASEAN's consensus approach also fits states prioritize their own control.
Makes sense. Progress is slow because everyone's calculating their own advantage. What about neo-functionalism? That sounds more dynamic.
It is. Neo-functionalism suggests integration in one area, like trade, creates pressures spillover that push for integration in others. Like if supply chains get really integrated, businesses might demand easier payments, maybe even a common currency, leading to new regional institutions.
Has Asia seen that kind of spillover effect?
To some extent, yes. Those regional production networks definitely pushed for trade deals like AFTA and the ASEAN +1 agreements. You could argue RCEP is a result of that market momentum needing a bigger framework.
But it hasn't snowballed into a political union like in Europe.
No, and that's the key limitation the review points out. Asia lacks those strong, independent, supranational bodies like the European Commission that actively push for deeper integration and have real power. The ASEAN Secretariat is quite weak in comparison. So integration tends to spill around existing structures rather than spill over into genuine political union. Plus, you get political spillback, nationalist reactions at home pushing against giving up more control.
Okay, next up, open regionalism and this idea of new Asian regionalism.
Open regionalism is about outward-looking integration, like APEC championed. Lowering barriers benefits everyone, not just members. New Asian regionalism is more descriptive of what's actually happened since the 90s. Pragmatic, multi-layered stuff, FTAs, financial cooperation like CM, ASEAN playing a central role. It's flexible, works alongside the global system, that noodle bowl effect.
And what does that mean for something like a single currency?
This approach avoids rigid commitments. It allows cooperation without necessarily aiming for full union. The downside. The review notes its voluntary nature and lack of enforcement mean agreed targets often get missed. It facilitates cooperation, but maybe hinders really deep integration.
So the path might be more gradual, coordinating currencies rather than replacing them.
Exactly. Maybe an Asian currency snake or using an ACU basket as a reference. Less decisive than Europe's treaty approach, but perhaps more realistic for Asia, though critics say this lack of commitment means initiatives can stall, like the CMI being largely unused.
Let's shift gears to constructivism. Ideas, identity, norms.
Constructivists ask, is there a shared Asian identity strong enough to support deep integration? They look at norms like the Asian way, consensus, non-interference. These help keep the peace, but they also limit how deep integration can go. The review even quotes an analyst saying these norms might be outdated for tackling today's economic challenges. National sovereignty remains a very powerful norm.
And beyond Southeast Asia, in the bigger picture.
Even harder. Is there a strong sense of Asianness across the whole continent? It's incredibly diverse. Historical baggage, especially in Northeast Asia, fuels nationalism and mistrust. Unlike Europe, there wasn't that post-war reconciliation drive across the board. And maybe no single unifying external threat, although, as we said, the current U.S. stance might be pushing things inadvertently.
So identity isn't really a strong driver yet.
Not for something as deep as a currency union. There's talk of an Asian century, sure, but deep down, national identities and suspicions dominate. The idea of an Asian union doesn't capture the public imagination like the European project did for many.
What about realism? Power, security, rivalry.
Realists are generally skeptical. They see strategic competition, China versus Japan, India versus China, as a major barrier. States fear rivals gaining dominance, so they're reluctant to pool sovereignty and institutions that could be controlled by others. Geopolitics trumps economics. Border clashes or maritime disputes can easily derail cooperation. They see Asia as fragmented by alliances and rivalries.
But couldn't shared external pressure, like U.S. protectionism, push rivals together economically?
Realists might concede that. If external pressure hits everyone, it creates a common interest in edging. The review notes U.S. trade actions reminded Japan and Korea of the risks of relying solely on the U.S., perhaps nudging them towards economic cooperation with China, despite strategic tensions. But realists would add a big caveat. Any integration will be judged on whether it shifts the balance of power. If it looks like it benefits one state too much, like RMB dominance, others will block it. Leadership is key, and supranational leadership is unlikely. They predict loose arrangements, not deep union.
Lastly, dependency theory, core periphery structures.
This view sees the world in terms of dominant core economies and dependent periphery ones. Historically, many Asian economies depended on the West for markets and capital. From this perspective, a single Asian market could be a way to reduce that dependency, create regional demand, strengthen South-South ties, and gain bargaining power.
But could it just create new dependencies within Asia?
That's the critical risk they highlight. Asia has its own internal core. Japan, China, Korea, etc., and periphery. Without strong mechanisms to help weaker economies like development funds, a single market could just concentrate wealth and industry in the core, widening the gaps. A potential Greece of Asia problem.
And a single currency from this view.
It could reduce dependence on the dollar, yes, but internally. There's the fear of RMB dominance, creating a new hierarchy within the bloc, where the currency policy favors the biggest players and potentially harms smaller ones. Dependency theory stresses the need for active policies, redistribution, development aid to ensure integration benefits everyone, not just the already powerful.
Wow. So each theory offers a different piece of the puzzle, highlighting different drivers and obstacles.
Exactly. It's incredibly complex. You need insights from all of them: national interests, market forces, institutions, identity, power politics, development gaps, to really grasp the challenges and possibilities for Asian integration.
That theoretical grounding is really helpful. Now let's make it concrete. Who are the actual players on the ground, the key actors who have to navigate all this complexity?
Right. For anything like a single market or currency to happen, you need unprecedented cooperation between the major players. China, Japan, India, and ASEAN as a bloc, and they all come to the table with very different histories, agendas, and levels of enthusiasm for deep integration.
Let's start with the heavyweights, China and Japan.
They're the indispensable economic engines, huge combined weight. But their relationship is famously complicated. History looms large war, territorial disputes, plus ongoing rivalry for regional influence and Japan's security ties with the U.S. It's this constant tension between economic interdependence, they trade a lot with each other, and strategic competition.
And they've backed competing integration ideas at times.
They have. Japan flooded the AMF idea in '97, which China wasn't fully behind, partly over dominance concerns. Japan led the CPTPP revival, excluding China. China pushed RCEP, which includes Japan. Different visions.
Is anything pushing them together now, though?
Well, that external pressure we talked about. The review notes U.S. protectionism can be an impetus for cooperation. When U.S. policies hit both, it kind of reminds them of shared risks, potentially creating common ground on strengthening regional economic ties, like their cooperation in RCEP, despite other tensions.
So they need something like the Franco-German engine that drove European integration.
That kind of fundamental political trust and shared vision would be ideal, but it's a very high bar. Both are deeply wary of the other dominating. Japan might push for strong rules, independent institutions, maybe like Germany in the Eurozone. China, given its size, will expect its interests, maybe the RMB's role, to be central. Agreeing on technical things like currency weights or who leads a regional central bank, incredibly tricky.
Their economies do complement each other, though, right? Tech, capital from Japan, market, manufacturing from China.
Yes, huge complementarity. But stable political relations are the prerequisite for that to translate into deep integration. Tensions over Taiwan or in the seas can easily freeze progress. Integration between them has historically moved forward when political ties were warmer. It needs sustained effort, high-level commitment, maybe joint projects to build confidence.
Okay, let's turn to India. The review called it a hesitant participant.
India is a giant of South Asia, huge population, growing economy, often included in grand visions of Pan-Asian integration. But historically, it's been less plugged into East Asian initiatives. Not in APEC, famously walked away from RCEP in 2019, its focus has often been more inward or westward.
Why the hesitation? What are the main reasons?
Several key factors mentioned. A big trade deficit with East Asia, especially China, raises fears about being flooded with imports under broader free trade deals. Strong domestic lobbies, farmers, small businesses worry about competition. And critically, strategic mistrust of China makes India very cautious about joining frameworks where Beijing might dominate.
But India does engage with the region. It has trade deals.
Oh, yes. FTAs with ASEAN, Japan, Korea, and its Act East policy shows intent. Including India would be huge for a single market, adding size, labor, and importantly, acting as a strategic counterweight to China, which might reassure smaller nations.
But it would also add a lot more diversity.
Absolutely. India's economic structure, income levels, inflation patterns, fiscal situation, they're quite different from many East Asian economies. That makes macroeconomic convergence much harder, raising that grease risk if integration happens too fast without support mechanisms. From that liberal intergovernmental view, India just hasn't seen the benefits clearly outweighing the risks yet.
The review also mentioned potential political calculations for India.
Yes, it notes that India's decision-making about joining broader Asian economic structures could potentially be influenced by its wider strategic goals in its neighborhood, suggesting economic integration might be viewed partly through a geopolitical lens.
And a single currency involving India.
That seems very far off. India values its monetary sovereignty highly, like many emerging economies, giving up the rupee and control over interest rates, a massive step, especially given current tensions with China. Partial cooperation, maybe currency swaps, seems much more plausible, if anything. India remains a wild card.
Finally, ASEAN. Central, but also a challenge.
ASEAN is pivotal. It's the foundation for much of Asia's regional architecture. ASEAN +3, RCP negotiations were driven by it. And the ASEAN Way consensus, non-interference, informality has been credited with keeping Southeast Asia relatively peaceful and providing a neutral ground for big powers.
But those same norms can be a drag on deeper integration.
Exactly. Consensus means the slowest member rules, hindering decisive action. Non-interference makes enforcing regional rules tricky. It's a double-edged double-edged sword. Good for stability and dialogue, but maybe too weak a foundation for the kind of deep integration needed for a single market or currency, especially when scaled up to include giants like China, Japan, and India.
So ASEAN might need to deepen its own integration first.
That's discussed, but it's tough. Changing the consensus rule needs consensus. ASEAN wants to stay central, but its approach makes rapid, deep integration difficult. One way forward, maybe, is that multi-speed idea again. A core group, maybe ASEAN plus 3, moves faster on some things using variable geometry, letting others join later. Sidesteps the consensus deadlock for the really ambitious stuff.
So managing the dynamics between these very different players, China, Japan, India, ASEAN, is absolutely central.
It's the core political challenge. Building the trust, finding the common ground. It requires extraordinary political will, something that's historically been lacking for projects this ambitious in Asia.
Given all that complexity, let's look at Europe again. The EU is the benchmark. What key lessons, good and bad, does the review draw from comparing Asia's situation with Europe's experience?
The comparison is really instructive. Asia can learn a ton, especially about institution building and crisis management, but it can't just copy-paste the EU model. The contexts are just too different.
What are the biggest institutional and political differences?
Institutions are a huge one. Europe built genuinely powerful supranational bodies. The Commission, Parliament, Court, the ECB. They can propose, enforce rules, often using majority voting. Asia has nothing like that. ASEAN Secretariat is weak, forums are intergovernmental, states keep control. There's no equivalent of the EU's hard law or enforcement.
And the original motivations were different too.
Starkly different. Europe was driven by post-war peace, then the Cold War threat, shared democratic values, U.S. backing initially. Asia's story is more about decolonization, asserting sovereignty, Cold War divisions, diverse political systems. No single galvanizing purpose like Europe had. Asian integration focuses on economics, avoids talk of political union, though, as we noted, maybe current external pressures could act as a sort of new driver. Unclear.
Europe had convergence criteria before the euro, the Maastricht rules. Asia.
No agreed regional targets in Asia, and the economic gaps are much wider: income, inflation, debt levels. Europe also had decades of policy coordination and those structural funds to help poorer members catch up. Asia lacks that kind of large-scale transfer mechanism. Getting the economic alignment needed for a single currency is just much, much harder.
What about cultural and language diversity?
Europe's diverse too, of course, but arguably it's fostered a stronger sense of shared identity, easier travel, more labor mobility. Asia's diversity is arguably greater. Language barriers are higher. Visa rules fragment movement more. National identities are very strong. That broad Asian identity needed to underpin deep union just isn't there in the same way Europeanists developed.
And acting as one block on trade.
The EU's single market came with a common external tariff and unified trade policy. Huge bargaining power. An Asian single market might stay more open externally, but it could try to gain that collective clout in negotiations. But that means giving up national trade policy control a tough sell.
Let's compare crises. The Eurozone crisis versus Asia's response with the Chiang Mai Initiative.
The Eurozone crisis was brutal, exposed flaws, monetary union without fiscal union. It forced huge bailouts, creation of the ESM Rescue Fund, the ECB stepping in massively. But crucially, the crisis drove deeper integration, more budget oversight, moves towards banking union. It showed you need strong crisis tools for a currency union.
And Asia after its 1997 crisis.
That crisis spurred cooperation, the CMI-CM swap lines. But as we discussed, CMM has never been used in a major crisis. Why? That IMF link, reluctance by states. Europe's crisis forced European institutions and money to save the system. Asia's crisis led to cooperation, but not that leap into deep binding integration.
So Europe's crisis led to more union, Asia's led to cooperation without deeper union.
That's a key takeaway. Europe strengthened its institutions. Asia created a useful tool, but its fundamental monetary setup didn't change. The euro crisis showed solidarity deepens if the political will is there. It also showed you need big independent crisis funds and strong surveillance before disaster hits.
Comparing central banks, the ECB, versus a hypothetical Asian Monetary Authority, or AMA.
The ECB is genuinely supranational, independent, sets one policy for the whole Eurozone, aims for price stability, uses majority voting mostly. A powerful example of pooled sovereignty.
And an Asian version, an AMA or Asian Central Bank.
Purely hypothetical, and the design challenges are immense. How do you decide votes? Equal say. Weighted by GDP, giving China, India huge power. Hard to imagine the giants agreeing to be regularly outvoted. Building that trust and compliance norm is a massive political lift.
And what would its goals be?
Another tough one, price stability like the ECB, or more focus on growth, employment. Asian countries often use exchange rates for competitiveness. They lose that tool, balancing surplus countries versus deficit countries. No easy consensus like Europe's initial focus on stability.
And just building the institution.
The ECB had decades of groundwork. Asia would need to massively scale up capacity, boost AMRO, maybe involve BIS or ADB or create something new. Needs top talent, independence from national politics. A huge undertaking.
So the big lesson from Europe is you need immense political will, trust, shared rules, strong institutions, crisis tools, all things Asia currently lacks at that scale for a full union.
Exactly. Europe's an inspiration, but also a cautionary tale. Integration without the foundations is risky. Asia faces bigger hurdles, but also sees what's needed: stronger institutions, more coordination, ways to manage gaps if it wants to head down that road, even slowly.
That comparison really hammers home the scale of the task. Let's focus now specifically on those obstacles. What does the review identify as the main hurdles, the really steep parts of this climb ahead for Asia?
It really is a litany of challenges, as the review puts it. Economic, political, socio-cultural,
Yeah.
deeply rooted.
Economic heterogeneity, the sheer diversity seems fundamental.
It absolutely is. You've got highly advanced economies, cheek by jowl with developing and lower income ones. Different structures, different priorities, different vulnerabilities to shocks. So asymmetric shocks are common. What hits one country might barely affect another or affect it differently. Research confirms this even within ASEAN. A single interest rate policy, it would inevitably be one-size-fits-none, potentially harming economies that need a different medicine but have lost their own policy tools.
And that malintegration point comes back here too.
Right. Even with high trade volumes in parts, it's often intermediate goods for export outside the region. Inter-ASEAN trade itself is still relatively low, so the benefits of removing currency friction within the region are less than in the highly integrated EU market. And because final demand is often external, global shocks still ripple through the internal network, making adjustment harder without independent currencies or flexible labor or fiscal transfers, both of which are very limited in Asia.
The review also stresses the lack of financial and institutional integration.
Yes, finance lags behind trade. Capital markets are fragmented, regulations differ widely, cross-border banking isn't seamless. Initiatives like the Asian Bond Market Initiative help, but it's slow progress. Research suggests this financial fragmentation actually holds back trade integration and would weaken any monetary union benefits because policy wouldn't transmit evenly.
And no region-wide financial watchdog?
Not really. No common standards, no unified supervisor like the EU is building with its banking union under the ECB. This makes the system vulnerable. A banking crisis in one country could spread much more easily without a clear regional authority to manage it. Effective monetary integration needs serious regional institutional building for surveillance and crisis management, a very tall order for Asia right now.
Then there's the obstacle mentioned again and again,
Yeah.
sovereignty and political will.
Arguably the Mount Everest of challenges. Asian states, many with sensitive histories, are extremely reluctant to cede power. National sovereignty is often seen as non-negotiable, especially in large countries like India or Indonesia. Asia's non-interference principle reinforces this reluctance to accept external oversight, which is essential for managing a shared economic space or currency.
And giving up your currency is a huge cession of sovereignty.
Fundamental. Issuing money, setting rates, core policy levers. Plus, the symbolism is powerful. National heroes on banknotes. Getting public buy-in to replace that with a regional currency? Difficult. Add geopolitical mistrust fears of Chinese dominance, China's own focus on the RMB, and it gets even harder. Without deep trust, states won't willingly cross that Rubicon into pooled sovereignty.
Domestic politics often pull in the opposite direction too.
Yeah.
Definitely. Governments use economic tools, subsidies, protections for certain sectors, state-led projects for domestic political reasons, for nation building. A single market with common rules and a single currency severely limits that national policy space. Governments fear losing those tools, fear instability or backlash at home. The strain seen in the Eurozone austerity protests, Euroscepticism, are a reminder of how tough it is to align diverse national interests under common rules.
Developmental disparities also tie into this political difficulty.
Yes, the wide gaps are a major issue. The EU used cohesion funds to help poorer members adjust. Asia lacks anything on that scale. Without ways to manage these disparities, a single market could just worsen them, concentrating growth in richer areas that Greece of Asia risk again. And implementing EU-style funds requires rich countries to transfer significant resources to poorer ones, a very tough political sell domestically in places like Japan or Singapore.
What about cultural and social barriers?
They matter too. Language differences limit labor mobility. While English is used by elites, general fluency varies. Nationalism remains strong. Historical grievances can flare up easily, especially in Northeast Asia. Without more grassroots connection and a stronger sense of shared regional identity, integration remains vulnerable to political winds.
And finally, external factors. How the rest of the world reacts.
That's often underestimated. Would a unified Asian bloc be seen as a threat by the US or Europe? Could it lead to more decoupling? It might force some Asian countries into difficult choices regarding alignment. US allies in the region would face strategic dilemmas. While some argue integration could reduce conflict risk, the potential for negative external reactions is a real strategic consideration. So yeah, the list is long and daunting. Divergent economies, weak institutions, sovereignty concerns, development gaps, limited social cohesion, external risks. The literature is pretty clear that Asia is currently not ready for deep monetary union. It requires a long, patient step-by-step process, immense political will, and serious confidence building.
That's certainly a steep climb. But as you said, the review doesn't just focus on obstacles. It outlines potentially huge strategic opportunities and benefits if Asia could make progress. What's the potential prize here?
Despite all those hurdles, the potential payoff is seen as massive. It's about fundamentally boosting Asia's resilience, its economic dynamism, and its global standing in what feels like an increasingly uncertain world.
The most obvious one seems to be reducing reliance on the West markets and currencies.
Absolutely. Especially given recent protectionist trends. A larger, more integrated internal Asian market, remember, over half the world's population, huge GDP, rising middle class, provides a powerful alternative engine for growth. It allows Asia to rely more on its own demand, its own consumers, making it less vulnerable to slowdowns or policy shifts in the US or Europe. Harmonizing rules and removing barriers internally makes it easier for companies to serve this vast regional market efficiently.
And the benefits of a single currency in that context.
It directly tackles that dollar dependence. Asia holds trillions in USD reserves, prices much of its trade in dollars. That creates exposure. A common Asian currency internalizes transactions, shields trade from dollar swings, avoids the weaponization risk, and accelerates regional de-dollarization efforts. Plus, it would stabilize exchange rates between Asian countries, ending fears of competitive devaluations that caused crises in the past.
What about projecting power? Enhanced bargaining clout?
Unity is strength. A single Asian market, negotiating as one bloc like the EU does, would have immense leverage in global trade talks. It could set regional standards that become global norms, push for investment rules that favor Asian interests, and speak with a much louder, coordinated voice in the WTO, the G20, everywhere.
And pushing back against protectionism.
Much more effectively. A united bloc can threaten credible retaliation, deterring others from targeting individual Asian countries unfairly. Geopolitically, it means a stronger voice in global governance, demanding reforms, potentially acting as a powerful independent pole in world affairs.
And navigating those tricky U.S.-China dynamics.
A more cohesive, self-reliant Asia might be better positioned to avoid being forced to choose sides. It provides a stronger internal anchor. For smaller states, being part of a larger Asian bloc offers protection against being dominated by either superpower. Think of ASEAN's role in RCEP. Bringing the giants together, that centrality could be scaled up.
Financial stability and resilience also come up as benefits.
Yes. A more integrated region, especially one moving towards monetary union with shared support mechanisms, could be better equipped to handle financial shocks. While the Eurozone crisis was bad, collective support ultimately prevented worse outcomes for individual members. An expanded CMI evolving towards an independent AMF could provide faster, less conditional support than relying on global institutions. Eliminating internal exchange rate risk also removes a major source of past instability.
And just pure economic efficiency, making things work better.
A true single market unlocks huge gains. Companies achieve economies of scale serving the whole region. Competition benefits consumers. That study, estimating an 11–14% trade boost from an ASEAN common currency, hints at the potential. Integrating capital markets could mobilize Asia's own vast savings for regional investment infrastructure, innovation reducing reliance on external finance and managing risks better. It encourages specialization, more efficient supply chains.
So the big picture prize is strategic autonomy, a stronger voice,
That seems to be the core strategic driver, empowerment, becoming a rule maker, not just a taker, insulating the region from external shocks and policies, building self-reliance. While integration isn't a magic bullet for peace, Europe's experience shows limits deep economic interdependence creates powerful disincentives for conflict. The prize is potentially transformative: resilience, growth, influence, stability. But again, it hinges on getting the integration right.
The potential is huge, the obstacles immense. So given this tension, what's the practical way forward? What policy recommendations do the review suggest, knowing a big bang isn't feasible?
The clear message is gradualism, incremental steps, often multi-speed, allowing willing countries to move faster. No grand treaty overnight. Focus on building the foundations.
What are the essential first steps?
Macroeconomic coordination is key. Bolstering policy dialogue, finance ministers, central bankers, maybe an ASEAN +3, starting with informal convergence targets on inflation, deficits, debt, not rigid rules, but benchmarks to aim for, build trust, share information. Maybe an Asian Monetary Policy Forum to discuss plans openly, commit to stability, manage volatility together, encourage more use of regional currencies in trade. Research also points to practical things: actively easing labor mobility by recognizing skills across borders, tackling those non-tariff barriers to boost intra-regional trade. These things make economies more similar, better suited for deeper integration down the road.
And learning from Europe's fiscal woes.
Absolutely. Build fiscal responsibility mechanisms before a crisis hits. This is politically tough in Asia, but maybe start with enhanced peer review of budgets via AMRO, early warning systems. Perhaps a voluntary code of conduct first, setting norms, aiming for transparency. Proactive, incremental steps are less painful than forced austerity later.
Strengthening institutions seems critical too.
Fundamental. Expand the CMIM reserve pool, definitely reduce that IMF link further, let it evolve towards a real Asian monetary fund. Empower AMRO, give it more resources, independence, a stronger mandate for surveillance, maybe like the IMF's Article 4 reviews, but regional.
What about a dedicated crisis fund for banks?
That's another key lesson from Europe. A dedicated facility may be linked to CMI, may be separate, to provide quick liquidity or recapitalization support to the financial sector in a crisis. Needs clear rules and resources to act fast and prevent contagion.
And building capacity for monetary cooperation itself, even without a single currency soon.
Yes. Network the national central banks better. Harmonize statistics, link payment systems. Maybe establish an Asian Monetary Institute, a think tank, training center to work on technical issues, research currency baskets, plan scenarios. It builds expertise and collaboration, mirroring Europe's early steps.
Could they pilot things within ASEAN first?
That's a suggestion. Maybe an Asian Monetary Institute or a nominal Asian central bank with very limited functions, perhaps managing a reference ACU. Proving concepts work at the ASEAN level could build confidence for wider Asia.
And just making existing trade deals work better.
Seems obvious, but crucial. Fully implement RCEP and CPTPP. Go beyond tariff services, investment, digital trade, harmonizing standards. Invest in connectivity, transport, digital to actually lower the cost of moving goods and services.
Financial integration needs deepening too.
Yes. Harmonize banking rules, supervision. Push forward with developing regional bond markets, promoting local currency use, making cross-border investment easier. Mobilize those Asian savings within Asia.
How to tackle the development gaps? That seemed like a tough one.
Politically very hard. A full EU-style cohesion fund seems unlikely soon. But maybe more targeted investments, aid focused on infrastructure or technology transfer in less developed regions, could help bridge the gaps incrementally.
And building trust and identity, the softer side.
Essential for long-term political will. Public awareness, cultural exchanges, youth programs, addressing historical issues through dialogue, track to diplomacy involving experts. It needs buy-in beyond just the elites.
And allowing different speeds, that variable geometry idea.
Seems like a practical necessity. Let a core group move faster on deeper integration if they're ready, while others participate in a looser arrangement or join later. It avoids gridlock caused by the least willing members. So the roadmap is about pragmatism. Acknowledge the difficulties, but chip away at them through concrete, manageable steps. Build the foundations, strengthen institutions, coordinate policies, foster trust, and be flexible about the pace.
Okay, so we've really taken a deep dive into the research on this huge, potentially transformative idea, a single Asian market and currency. We've seen what's pushing it back onto the agenda in today's shifting world.
And the experts are clear. Asia is currently nowhere near ready. The hurdles, economic diversity, political mistrust, Weak institutions, lack of shared identity, they're massive. They're deeply rooted.
But on the flip side, the potential prize is enormous. The strategic value, the benefits, greater self-reliance, resilience, growth, global influence, they're incredibly compelling.
It really is this tension between immense promise and these deeply entrenched challenges. Getting there would require unprecedented political commitment, institutional change, and maybe most importantly, trust across the region.
The review leaves us with this thought. Asia finds itself, in some ways, somewhat alone in a fragmenting global order. So the big question is, given the scale of the internal obstacles, the history, the politics, the sovereignty concerns, can that external pressure really be enough to force the unity needed for such a bold vision? And what would that actually mean, not just for Asia, but for all of us navigating this changing world? Something to think about.
A profound question for the future.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.